Welcome to one of the installments of our GIACE weekly series, where we ask one of our 14 research projects under the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program to come together and talk to us a little bit about their project, some of their research findings and insights, and as these projects are coming to a close, what we can think about looking forward and policy recommendations looking ahead. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Klopp, who is a research scholar at the Columbia University Climate School, and she'll be joined by her colleagues Brian Barasa from the Barasa Center for Behavioral Economics and David Orega from Southeast Africa. They're going to be discussing their work on corruption, its resiliency at the Kenyan-Ugandan border, and especially its effects on small-scale female traders. We'll be dropping some links into the chat about some interesting working papers that have recently come out of the project, and I think that's going to really inform a lot of the discussion today. Before we get into the project and let these folks take it away, I did want to quickly talk about some of the core principles that underpin the GIACE program. Specifically, the idea is that this research should be problem-focused and focused on anti-corruption and anti-corruption solutions, not just exploring how corruption can manifest. Problems should be issue-driven and specific, rather than applying a prescriptive one-size-fits-all approach to corruption. It should address real-world priorities and incentives in specific sectors. The projects should take into account political will and really focus in on what is a politically viable reform in this context. And as is really relevant to this project, it should try and measure the impacts and effects of anti-corruption interventions, engaging policymakers and practitioners from nose to tail of the research process. And I think that that's something that is really well executed by this project, since we have some of the practitioners that worked with Dr. Klopp here today talking to us about the research process itself. Jackie and her colleagues are gonna take over the presentation. And after that, I'm gonna hand things over to Johannes, who's coming to us from Global Integrity, who's gonna be doing moderation for this event. And so you can direct all questions in the chat or to Johannes. You can raise your hand in the Zoom function, or you can message me personally. I'm Veronica, Global Integrity in the chat. So if you have any questions, let me know, but I'm really excited to let Jackie take the floor.
Thanks so much, Veronica. It's a real pleasure to present for the first time some of our findings and insights from our Global Integrity Project. I'd like to first ask my colleague, Brian Barasa from Barasa Center for Behavioral Economics to briefly introduce himself, and then I'll ask David to do the same, and then we'll start.
Hi, Jackie. Hi, everyone. Let me just put my video on. So my name is Brian Barasa. I work with Barasa Center for Behavioral Economics. So Barasa is a research and advisory firm based in Nairobi, Kenya. And as Barasa, we work with researchers and institutions to advance and apply behavioral science in pursuit for poverty alleviation. I'm so happy to be part of this discussion today.
Thanks, Brian. David?
Hello, everyone. My name is David Orega from Southeast Africa. So at Southie, basically what we do is to leverage USSD technology to deliver tailor-made trade and market information to small-scale cross-border traders, and also give them an opportunity to report incidences of harassment and corruption that they go through at the border crossings. It's my pleasure to join all of you.
Thanks so much, David. So the work that you're going to see right now is very much a collaboration of these three main partners, along with a lot of traders, as you're going to find out. So we're going to talk about corruption, gender, and small-scale cross-border trade in East Africa with a focus on Busia and, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go, change the slide. with a focus on Busia at the Kenya-Uganda border and Taveta at the Kenya-Tanzanian border. And the big picture here is that small-scale cross-border trade is really important to livelihoods, regional integration, and food security in East Africa and beyond, across the continent. And yet corruption and harassment are very serious problems that hinder this important trade and have adverse impacts on livelihoods and food security and well-being, especially in border areas. And we need to better understand this corruption and harassment faced by these traders to improve our interventions. Currently, there are a number of gaps that we found from our research that motivated us to try to fill them. First of all, a lot of anti-corruption interventions and border service improvement programs tend to focus on the predominantly male large-scale traders, whereas, as Veronica mentioned, the vast majority of small-scale traders are women. And so this is a bias problem in policy. How gender dynamics work at the borders is very important and needs to be factored into policies. Again, a lot of the customs officials, police, the officials are mostly men. And again, the small scale traders are women. So you know there's got to be some sort of gender issues, although we found some very interesting things when we did our research around young men who are transporters as well and their role and their problems. Another gap is the data is often very patchy about small scale cross-border trade. We did a review and we found that there is increasing numbers of studies. They're increasingly creative and interdisciplinary, but they tend to focus on Busia, and which is well studied. And they're, they don't give us the full picture. And one of the issues is that, of course, small scale cross-border trade has aspects of informalities that often present problems for gathering data. And the other thing we found is that the potential of using mobile phones to support research to address these kinds of gaps hasn't really been fully explored. Traders are increasing their use of phones for all sorts of ways to improve their trade, and David will talk more about that and how we leverage that in this research. We have a lot of questions that we're trying to answer, but here are some of the key ones we can talk about today, and that is how can we leverage mobile phones to better acquire data directly from traders on their experiences with corruption. And what new insights can we also glean from observing the impact of the COVID border restrictions? It's a kind of natural experiment because all of a sudden there's a lot more barriers at the formal border for public health reasons. And what might we use reporting on mobile phones as an anti-corruption tool? So not just for using phones for gathering data, but going beyond that in our anti-corruption work. And then what ways can we use this kind of research to actually improve interventions of border governance? So we have some ideas about that. The first important thing to recognize is that at these borders, you have the formal customs that emerged out of colonial state formation. And you have a lot of what the traders call ungazetted pathways. These are pathways, many of them prior to colonial rule that traders used. And they're often very close to each other, as you can see in Busia. And so traders have, these small scale cross-border traders have an option. Do I take the ungazetted pathway or do I try to go through formal customs? And what motivates them to do one or the other is very important. But one thing that's often neglected is this question of what happens at customs influence what happens at the ungazetted pathways and how do these interact? Because there's a sort of belief that these ungazetted pathways are informal or not, there's this kind of open secret in a way in policy. A lot of times they just focus on the formal border without thinking about these interactive effects. And as I mentioned, one of the interesting things, I mean, COVID has been a horrible tragedy for everyone, including people in East Africa. But it does present an opportunity to learn. As I mentioned, it's like a natural experiment where you get severe barriers, including really banning of small-scale cross-border traders from using the customs. And so it allows us to say what actually happens when you have these restrictions of various kinds, which can also be like corruption, right? Of any kind that makes it much harder for small-scale traders to cross the border. Oh dear, I'm sorry. So what did we do? Our methods were, as I mentioned, multidimensional, like what is, and interdisciplinary, like what is happening more broadly in this sector. And we believed heavily in collaborating with traders, so not seeing them as objects of study, but as active participants in our work, because after all, we want our research to support them. So we started with this strong collaboration that we mentioned already. We began with qualitative research, which is very, very important, to talk to people, to interview them, including the officials at the border. We produced a contextualization study to inform our quantitative work. And we had a team at the School of International and Public Affairs do a wonderful report on talking to a lot of policy actors on gender specifically in small-scale cross-border trade and what some of the issues were. We did an extensive literature review, which we published at open access so anyone can read it. And there, as I mentioned, we found that there's a lot of really exciting work, including by people like Eleanor Weissman. But there needs to be a lot more, and there needs to be a lot more systematic work. And we believe that, again, cell phones can help us here in many ways. So what did we do? We did, in part because of COVID, to be honest, we did iterative phone surveys with a large group of traders that we had recruited before COVID really started to take off in East Africa. We had 2,280 traders from these two borders. And we tried to make it representative of what small-scale cross-border traders, the cross-border traders group looks like. So we had primarily women and about 20% men. I think in the future, we would try to have more men so we could do more statistics on the gender dynamics. In any case, we did 4 monthly surveys that were very extensive through December 2020 to June 2021. And we asked them a set of core questions that get at how they think about, their experience crossing the border, what they also think about policies and what was happening and the impacts of COVID. And what we did is we did iterative surveys. So when we found something interesting in the first one, we modified questions or added 1 or 2 within the spirit of the survey to see what other kinds of information we could get. We also did a little experiment that's very exciting with Sauti East Africa. We had Sauti build a reporting tool on their platform. And the reporting tool would allow traders to report on what route they used. We didn't ask them specifically, but we asked whether they went through the customs yard or not, the amount they paid through that process, the value of the goods they were trading in that trip. The time consumption, we didn't really ask specifically how much time, but we asked if they had to wait or not, and the comfort of their trip. How good was it? So we're trying to get at service quality, but we can also get a lot of other interesting and important information, as I'll show you. And this tool was built by Sauti, and we recruited 199, well, we recruited more than those traders to use the platform, which was hard. It was during COVID. We had to telephone recruit. And yeah, and we got them to use that reporting platform through April, September 2021. So it was a really interesting experiment. And to my knowledge, the first of its kind. So here's a representation of what that looks like. You can have a very basic phone. This runs on USSD that David can explain to you. And traders input what language, and then they start to give us information. And we would do this, one trip per week. And we would have a dashboard that you see here where we could actually see how many users, what their information is, almost, a real-time, approximately real-time idea of what their experience is at the border. And then we did interviews with every single one of those traders. Some of them did not use the platform. We wanted to know why. And those who used the platform, we wanted to understand how they experienced it, and also how they thought it might be useful or not in their struggles. And very importantly, and here I have to thank Ambika very much for all her organization and support of this process. We had a validation workshop with traders in Busia November last year, where we systematically gave them our results from the experiment and the surveys and asked them whether these results made sense to them. But further, we got their deep insights into why we were seeing what we were seeing. So what did we see? I'm going to give you just a tiny sliver of some of the interesting findings. We obviously have a massive database from all of this. But the first thing we found that's very clear is that COVID and the restrictions that were put on small-scale cross-border traders was a massive shock. You can see from these numbers from our surveys that large numbers of the traders in our group had dropped out. And we found that women disproportionately dropped out, suggesting that they were, they tended to be like less wealthy or less able to deal with this kind of shock. Now, the wealthier traders could come up with strategies. For example, they could come together and hire a truck because trucks could cross, let's say, the Busia border at a certain time, but they would not accept people walking or using other means of transport. So this was one thing that was very clear. There was a lot of hardship, and there wasn't really a strategy for dealing with this because I don't think the government thought about the implications of this policy on this group of people. And the majority of traders said they were absolutely going to return, and they're going to need some help. The other thing we found is that corrupt actors adapt to the context. We found that you can imagine if the number of traders go down, if you're extracting money from them, maybe you might extract more if from the remaining traders to make up your quota, or you have more opportunity because the restrictions are much, much harsher. So you can actually ask for more when you're extracting from traders. The majority of traders did report that corruption and harassment worsened with these restrictions. Interestingly, large percentages reported paying what they call kitu kidogo, something small, which is an informal payment for allowing them to cross the ungazetted route, for example. But they rarely were asked for COVID documents, which obviously suggests one of the most obvious strategies is you're now mostly using the ungazetted routes. It's too expensive to adapt to these restrictions for most traders, and some of them wanted to continue to trade. It was their livelihood. And it not to trade was a huge economic hardship. So from a public health point of view, not really addressing this ungazetted route is also a problem because clearly people are going across the ungazetted routes and there's not public health support for them or any kind of screening. So again, it's so important to be looking at these ungazetted routes. And in terms of corrupt actors adapting, clearly the police are an enormous issue. They were the most feared actor. And they clearly are mobile, so they can move to the ungazetted routes, or they are always there anyway. And we did find that the Kitu Kidogo that was being asked for on the ungazetted routes went up. And the interesting thing is we captured data from Taveta before, while their border was closed to small-scale traders, and then there was change in Tanzania and the border opened, as Alfred can talk to us about. And we saw that, we saw a change in the data, which was really interesting. We had asked them a question that they're rarely asked, and that was, do you think that there are too little, too many, or just the right amount of police at the border? And before, when they were going, you know, when the border was closed, they were obviously, you know, there were fewer of them. They were more likely to encounter the police. The police were asking for more. That a large fraction said there were too many police. And when the formal border opened, all of a sudden that dropped, that, you know, things had gotten a little bit more back to normal. But still, the important thing is there's a very substantial fraction, regardless, that think there are too many police and that they do fear the police. And some of the qualitative data really shows why they fear the police, which is no surprise. You know, but some of the things they reported were very severe, like the Ugandan police officer who actually shot and killed one of the traders' brokers. So there is real fear here and real human rights violations and real danger in not addressing this question of these ungazetted routes. This is a really interesting finding that we found that men actually reported a little bit higher than average Kitu Kidogo and more harassment compared to women. And this is a significant result. It puzzled us at first, but when we talked to the traders in Busia and some of the young Boda Boda riders, the motorcycle transporters, it became clear that one of the strategies that small-scale traders women had, was to use these motorcycle transporters. So they would connect and they would, you know, with their fellow trader in Uganda and or the person they're sourcing from, and they would have these young men who are less risk averse to traverse the border, and they encountered horrible, you know, extraction all along the way, so it turns out that these young men who are critical to the trade for these women really did experience a lot of harassment. We really need to take thinking about all these different actors in the network of trade and what they're experiencing. And interestingly, the vast majority of men felt that this was the case when we asked the traders, do you think this is true? And about half the women felt it was also true, that men experienced more trouble because of this reason. Of course, we have to dig a little deeper. The other thing that's really important here is that ungazetted routes do offer advantages. You can see that, you know, when things happen at customs, that makes it hard for the traders, whether that's also a lot of corruption, so you're paying more. The small scale traders, as you can see from this graph, tend to pay less at the ungazetted border route. And so when you have a small amount of goods, maybe the bribe you're paying is less than what you might be paying, or if we want to call it a bribe or extortionary fee, or Kitu Kidogo is less. So for the poorer traders, it seems like this is a really big advantage to them, which suggests that you can't just look at what the formal fees are, because a lot of these traders don't pay when they are small scale traders as they cross the border, the customs point. But in practice, it seems like they might be, and that, you know, the ungazetted route has its attractions. So again, it's important that we consider this in policy. And as I mentioned, they're often not. So some basic overall insights. One, we learned about the sort of unintended consequences of policies that ignore these ungazetted routes and how they interact with customs and the corruption dynamics and the gender dynamics. So that's something we really have to think about. And also, one of the interesting things is we asked traders in the survey and also in person whether they felt that the money they were giving to primarily the police in the ungazetted routes was just, because they were evading customs. So, the police were kind of aiding and abetting that. The traders were furious. They said, absolutely not. This was an unjust payment. And one of the young the transporters very eloquently explained that this ungazetted or informal status of this route that most of them take, allows the police to extract, because it gives them the reason for why they're extracting. And yet they formalize their informal extraction, because if you go to Busia, there's something called the checkpoint, the point, where the police literally sit. And so, they're taking advantage of the fact that this ungazetted route is somehow considered, right, customs evasion, even though it's very institutionalized. So that was very important. They didn't see that, they're quite upset about this, and this needs to be dealt with. Oh, shoot. There always has to be something that happens with these. So sorry about that. We are really coming to the end. Maybe while I deal with this mess, I don't know why it does this. Maybe I'll invite, because I'm at the very end anyway, maybe I'll invite Brian or David to comment, and I'll just pop up the policy recommendations once I get this straightened out. I'm not sure what happened there. Okay. Brian, did you want to comment on anything I've said so far while I fix this?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just to add something that we already mentioned. I think during the validation exercise in Busia, we saw that corruption is a vice that most of these traders are really facing, and it actually became worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. And most of them actually experienced a lot of human rights violations. And some actually lost their lives. Others were forced to stop trading. And it actually took a lot of traders to have, most traders with those who actually traded and had the guts to cross the border really faced a lot of brutality. And it's something that we believe that with aggregated data across the border, it's something that we could leverage that and use the data to come up with evidence-based advocacy to try and make the trade border experiences much easier and much safer for the small-scale traders.
That is perfect. You've taken us right to the recommendations. Thanks, Brian. We're a good team. Yeah, so just like Brian says, we think that this data can help us. I think we have we're still analyzing a lot of it, but I think there's strong evidence that we have to make customs more friendly to small scale traders in consultation with them and paying attention to gender. They asked, for example, for women's desks and trading desks and like more of a formal institutional presence that supports them at the formal border. They mentioned the Ugandan women's desk as a successful thing. They would like to see them fully funded and staffed. And the other thing that came up is that facilitating other modes of transport, there's a really big focus on the big trucks and getting them through. And even that is often a problem, because corruption is a problem for the large scale traders. But for example, at the Busia border, it's very hard to take a motorcycle across, especially if you have large numbers of goods, because you're not allowed to you have to get off and you have to like walk the entire way. And so, that's a really big issue to figure out, like put more of that focus on those traders. Like how would you redesign the customs? Or as what the traders mentioned to us was the desire to formalize the ungazetted routes in some way, because their lack of recognition, as I mentioned, causes problems. Now that has to be done very carefully, and there are plans to create a formal, like, kind of border at the market, at the border by Trademark East Africa, which a lot of traders in the surveys thought as an abstract idea was good, but when we started to talk to traders on the ground, they had a lot of different concerns. And so I think this question of how do we deal with this formalization of what's already happening in a way that protects traders and reduces the extraction is a key question. And you can't do that without thinking about police reform, because, you know, the police are key actors here. And it seems like a lot of the work that's done on anti-corruption involves like the one-stop border post, or which is like creating more transparency at the customs, formal customs area, and ignores this question of the police that rove around and are particularly big problems for the small-scale cross-border traders. I think a substantial number of them felt there were too many police. Now, of course, this is all needs to be unpacked.
Jackie,
You're on mute.
Jackie, you've muted yourself.
Oh, you would think I would get this all down by now. Last but not least, I just really want to thank everyone. We had so many people involved in this project, and they were all so terrific, including the Global Integrity team that's here. So we wanted to say thank you, and we'll open it up. I think I'll if it's okay, Johannes, I'll just ask David to make a few comments, and maybe Professor Sebaheni as well, and then it's all yours. Thank you.
That sounds great. David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Jackie. I think your presentation covers it all. And I guess maybe it's worth noting that a lot of the times these cases of corruption, really, the traders are always willing to report them. But then the big issue is they want action on them. I think it's important, maybe at this point in time, maybe for technology to be taken advantage of, so that maybe the traders can get platforms through which they can report these maybe situations. And it would be great, ideally, if action could be taken so that the traders could feel that at least there's someone listening to them. I know using phone USSD precisely, there's an element of anonymity, and the traders feel a lot more comfortable maybe writing about the experiences they go through, but then without any action or any follow-ups from the agencies concerned, then ideally these reports really don't count, don't really mean a lot. So maybe it might be important, even as issues around policies are being discussed, then maybe systems put in place to ensure that maybe reports from small-scale cross-border traders could be actioned, at least to help them make the trading environment to be a lot more conducive for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And Alfred Sebaheni, do you also want to comment?
Oh, very much so. Thank you very much for the invitation. I had a privilege of doing a study on border vulnerability to corruption within the East African region. And traders are really a very important group when it comes to East African integration. And this study is really very, very important. I am only concerned about how we make customs more friendly because of the different focus in terms of policies according to countries. So the language is not the same. There are some countries whereby traders are given priority, and particularly women, whereby they can speak about the challenges they are facing, but others, they're not making this formal. And so there is a huge challenge there. I think something must be done maybe another kind of study, how do we make customs more friendly? Is really a challenge. But what goes with making customs more friendly is the challenge of infrastructure. Some borders within the East African region have limited kind of infrastructure, and this opens up the door for further corrupt activities, which is really a huge challenge. So that's what I wanted to contribute to this meeting. And finally, let me say, police reform is what is needed, really. And it's not easy at all, because it involves quite a lot of resources, the political will, and all policy issues. But for me, I think I want to take that as something very, very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these observations. Let's build on that in a minute, but prior to that, let me just say thank you to Jackie, Brian, and David, and the entire team, because I know on Jackie's end, there's also so many other people who have been involved in this over the past 3 years. It is a fantastic project, and for very different reasons, much to love about it. And one of the key items that I find so interesting and valuable is precisely that you really start with this question: why does this matter? Why do we need to look at this topic? Why do we need to take the sectoral approach, really diving deep? And how do we make sure that we double check against those who are really affected by this form of corruption, to then figure out what to do next? So I think this presentation of yours, Jackie, which was really well presented and hugely insightful, and also the comments now by you, Alfred and David and Brian, point us precisely into the right direction, which is to ask a few more questions based on your experience and the findings that you found about how to action this sort of finding. What do you think are ways to take this forward? And how, Jackie, Brian, and David, how is you thinking about taking next steps on this front? So I wonder if any one of you would want to speak to that in terms of hypotheses either, or concrete plans that you might have, that Busara and Sauti might have, Trademark East Africa might have, in terms of utilizing the findings of your study and taking next steps. And I think, so let me turn that question back to you to just look into the future a little more, but also to open up really to everybody else on this call and ask whether you have any questions and thoughts that could help contribute to this topic, provide additional insights, or help us make sense of this and take it forward. So if you want to either sign up and raise your hand here, or put your thoughts in the chat, either of that will work, and we can just structure the questions and then have a good discussion about it.
I can start on next steps. So we had this validation workshop, and we came out of that with some very concrete things that the traders thought could be helpful. Some of them seem quite simple to do if you had budget, like having more presence at for the traders, especially the small scale traders, at the customs point, and a group that advocates for them and is physically there, like a trade desk or women's desk, or ideally, a small scale trader desk. That's doable. And it was something they wanted. Clearly, some of the other things that are more complex, like recognition of these, ungazetted routes, needs a lot of thought. And like Alfred said, like a lot more work has to be done with the traders to how to redesign those customs points for them. So that's something that should be done. And with Busia specifically, the problem with the transport, where the transporters feel like they deliberately make it hard for them, that also needs to be addressed with the transporters, who are critical actors in this trade and often ignored. So that's important. And then I just want to say that one thing that we're going to be doing next is every single trader, since we have their contact through the phone, we'll be getting a copy of the policy brief, everything that we've done here, and we will send it out back to them. And that is something that, they will be able to use, including their associations, to advocate, based now not just on this is what we want, but on also the results of, a fairly rigorous set of studies. So I'll ask my colleagues maybe to add to that. And then I also see I have some wonderful colleagues here today. I'm delighted to see Henry Ochieng of the Kenya Alliance of Resident Associations, a dear old friend and very wise, and my colleague James Smart, who is a fantastic journalist and a real anti-corruption promoter through that medium. So I don't know if they would like to speak out, but I would really invite them to as well.
David or Brian, did you want to come in and amend or supplement the points that Jackie made?
And Henry also has a question. Johannes, I don't know if you want to ask Henry, because I think his hand is raised.
Yeah, I see that. I think we wanted to first hear whether David or Brian had, but if not, then that's fine too. And we'll give you a few more minutes perhaps and go over to Henry. That's right, Henry.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Jackie and team, for the excellent work that you've done. I'm really happy to see how much information we've been able to gather. I really wanted to really get more insight on what exactly is the reason why the traders are avoiding the customs. Is it because it's too costly? Is it because of the bureaucracy? Is it more convenient, or why are they avoiding to use the customs and going to the ungazetted routes? So perhaps, I know you've already touched on that a bit, but what was like the major reasons? Perhaps the other thing I also wanted just to understand from Jackie and team is how the traders are making use of their association to be able to address some of the challenges that they face. Because like you mentioned at one point that it might not be easy for individuals to perhaps raise issues, but if they have this strong association that act on their behalf, then it will be more effective in terms of making sure that their challenges are addressed. So perhaps during your conversation, it might have come about some impression of how effective are these associations and how are they making use of them to ensure that the issues are being addressed. And then lastly is the extent of these ungazetted routes. Is there a high proliferation? Are they so many to the extent that majority of traders are actually using that compared to those who are using the customs, or it is something that there are just a few routes that are being used by the traders? So those are some of the things that are going through my mind, but of course, I'm happy to read more of the detail of the report and be able to understand just exactly what are some of the key issues that came through. But thank you very much for the excellent work, and we look forward to having more information on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. David, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So maybe I'll respond to how the traders maybe take advantage of the associations. And for fact, yes, in all these places that we carried out the studies, there are associations, women cross-border trade associations, which are pretty active. And as a matter of fact, even in the events that we're having, there was a representation of Uganda Women Cross-Border Traders Association, whereby the chairperson of the whole association actually came, and then on the Kenyan side. So for this association, actually, they always have meetings, cross-border meetings, whereby authorities from the Kenyan side and also from the Ugandan side, like have a sit down together to try and address issues that really affect the women in trade. Obviously, there are issues which are just beyond their level. For example, when it comes to issues on non-tariff barriers, of course, the NTB is to be addressed at a higher level than probably at the local level where these women are part of. So the associations, yes, they are active, trying to do a lot. But then on the issues around how the borders are porous, you realize that these women, they choose to use the panya routes for a number of reasons. One of them is like the panya routes are convenient for them. For example, if you're looking at Busia Kenya and Busia, Uganda. So a trader who is coming from the Ugandan side find it more convenient using the panya route because it's just like a few steps and on the Kenyan side. Unlike maybe if you decide to use the official route, and see, as Jackie did mention, when using the customs yard, even motorbikes are not supposed to pass through when the rider is riding. So that makes it really, really expensive for them. So of course, again, when it comes to using the border, there's the issue around convenience, and then the panya routes, issues around convenience. And then also it's a bit cheaper because, Jackie did mention about, like those stop points whereby there are cops, and probably maybe a rider will pay about 50 shillings, an equivalent of Kenya shillings 50, and then they pass through that place, irrespective of what you're carrying. But then if you're using the official route, of course, the issues around inspection of your commodity, there could be some taxes being levied. Of course, there could be issues around standards of commodities that probably will make those commodities not be allowed to pass through. So they find a lot more convenient using the panya route because it's cheaper for them. And then like it's in terms of like the time taken to cross the border is also a lot less on the panya routes. And then the panya routes are also very, very close to the market areas where they're supposed to be selling their wares. So it's a lot more convenient for them. That is why probably there is the question on whether or not we should even be asking our governments, instead of calling these informal routes, maybe we can have revenue authorities also being positioned in those places, because either way, the police officers are collecting money from there. So it's only fair that maybe we can have the right agencies that are supposed to be doing this job probably being stationed in those places so that maybe the monies can be collected on behalf of the government. So maybe, Brian, if you want to, you can answer the other questions, please.
Thanks, David. I think you've tackled everything.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a very good pointer. One of the things that strikes me about your presentation, the study, and even these few first instances of conversation around it, is that we do look at a situation where we have very clear aspects of both structure and agency, right? Formal or even informal routes that are describing a system in which people are able to make certain choices within their context. And as you pointed out in your presentation, Jackie, and is now being discussed, there is a question about what is that right equilibrium of people making those choices and feeling comfortable about choosing one route or the other, and how my policy interventions actually respond to those choices and move slightly towards situations that are somewhat better than they are now. I wonder, Brian, from your perspective and the perspective of behavior out of Busara, where do you think the focus should be set? Is that a focus on trying to identify what the formal or informal structures are and reforming those? Or is there something about enhancing agency by those traders, as Jackie mentioned, through additional use of phones, the provision of data, perhaps thinking around ways of building coalitions at that level of traders themselves, or simply enhancing those coalitions? What are the most useful steps? Is there some way of thinking about sequencing in order to make inroads to understand how to solve this series of problems?
Thank you, Johannes. Yeah, I think to address this, because the trade, just like Jackie pointed out, it's a consortium of different agencies, and for this to be addressed, there is need for us to start engaging with different stakeholders, different players in the space of trade, and basically just trying to understand what is the way forward that these issues can be addressed to make the trade border experiences better. For example, when we're doing the validation with the traders, they reported that they would like some of the findings be shared to the relevant authorities, and we believe by starting such conversations early enough and working in cahoots with the relevant agencies, I think it will be the first step in trying to make the trade border experiences much better for the small scale traders.
Great. David, do you have additional thoughts on that? Or is your hand still up from prior? I think David's hand is still up from the prior intervention. Well, thank you. Do we have other burning questions by anyone on the call about either the findings of the study or how to think about next steps?
Hello.
Hi, Edna.
Yes, I'm calling from Kampala. There's something I wanted to get clarified because I was reading through the report and I didn't understand. This is the ladies are passing through porous routes to cross to the other country, but then they find policemen who are taking advantage of them. So these policemen are stationed in Panya routes. What are they doing there? Aren't they illegally there themselves? Why should they take chance? Why should they exploit the ladies when they are passing through porous routes? And what are they doing in those porous routes? Are they legally supposed to be there? Thank you.
Jackie, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I will, and then I'll let David, since he works so closely with these traders with Sauti, also respond. But yeah, so it's also young men in these routes. It's not just women, but mostly women. Yeah, these police go to extract, and what we found is on the Kenyan side, it's mostly the police. On the Ugandan side, around Busia, it's the Ugandan soldiers. There's an army base there, which is particularly terrifying. There's the police. There's also local government officials. So there's actually on the Ugandan side, what the traders told us was there's a whole raft of extractors, if you will, along these routes. So you know, because these routes are not recognized, technically, this could be customs evasion. But, you know, these are old routes, as, you know, what David was saying, and is that, you know, they're more direct a lot of times. And so there's a long history of using these trade routes in many cases. And customs is often difficult. And complicated, and even a circuitous route to try to do this trade. So there needs to be a reimagining, like David said, of how to manage this. And these porous routes just become revenue extraction opportunities for the police. In fact, there was one excellent paper done by someone from Egerton University that pointed out that people fear that in places like Busia, that the police are so busy extracting, they're not actually fighting crime or doing the things they're supposed to do. So it is very irregular, and that's why we need to address it. David, did you want to talk more to that issue?
Oh, yes, thank you, Jacqueline. Yeah, so it is true from the observation that actually it's a lot risky for women to use the Panya routes. And from the conversations we've been having with some of these women traders, you do realize that some of them do not even understand, for example, the documents they need in order for them to legally cross the border. We are aware that there are a lot of women who do cross-border business, but whenever they want to cross the border, when they want to go out the other side of the border, they don't even remember to carry their national identity cards. So to that regard, they are not able, they won't just be in a position to cross the formal route. And the easier option in this case for them is the Panya route. So I feel that the best way probably to make our women to use a lot of the formal border crossing is to probably empower them with the requisite information that they need in order for them to make informed decisions as far as what they need to do to cross the border legally is concerned. Again, if you're looking at whenever they're crossing the border, you will find a lot of them for sure, like they know that that is the only option for them, because all the stories they've had about the formal route, issues around extortion, how expensive it is, how brutal the police officers are. So on this other side, they feel that it's easier to pay maybe the 50 Kenya shillings or the 100 Kenya shillings and get their goods through the border without a lot of issues. And I know you did ask whether it is okay to have the police officers manning those informal routes. I would say it is correct to have the police officers in those stations, because a lot of the illegal trade, and now illegal trade here to mean smuggling, high-level smuggling, really take place using those panya routes. And you would imagine that maybe the police officers are stationed there to ensure that maybe smuggling doesn't happen. Of course, we know sometimes our police officers may not do the job that they're expected to do, but ideally their responsibility and their role there is just to ensure that at least they can contain issues around smuggling. So probably to make our women traders move from using the panya routes to the official custom routes, it might be really imperative probably to create more awareness in terms of procedures that they need to follow, in terms of, for example, the documents that they need to have. And of course, also make the borders to be friendly to women, and especially those who might not have the best of education. Because then you realize maybe the people that normally do cross-border business at a low-scale level, people who might not have the best of education. So whenever maybe the systems and the processes are complicated for them, then they shy away from using those designated border crossings and resort to the panya routes. But I agree, the police officers should, in my opinion, should be stationed in those panya routes, and they should do the job that they're supposed to be doing, not collecting money, my opinion.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're coming up on the hour. There's, I thought I saw, oh yeah, there is another question in the chat, but maybe we can note that and then get back to that at a later point after this panel comes to an end. Maybe just to say thank you again to everybody at this point. This is a fascinating study, and just looking at the implications this has, both for policy and for thinking about policy, and really having a useful, sensible data to make use of in order to inform policy, but also in terms of thinking about new ways to do research and to build on this study and to then inform advocacy. I think there's much to be learned from this. As Veronica pointed out, there are the 2 working papers, which she has put in the chat. Please look at those, or we can also send around another email to share the working papers with everybody who has signed up. And I think with that, I'll close. Thank you again, Jackie, Brian, and David for your presentations and all the work that has gone into this. And everybody else, feel free to join us again next week on Thursday for a next installment of the session, talking about the many different projects we've done through the GIACE program. Thank you.